I was growing up, I got to read these books fairly regularly. That was part of our family worship experience every day. And now that I'm a grandfather, yes, I did it for my children. But now that I'm a grandfather, I'm going through them again. And, you know, it's interesting. You read these stories, and I'm going to start with this one right here. This is, well, I can't see what book it is. Let's see, I think it's book 6. And this one, the two stories that are here are When God Washed the World and The Borrowed Axe. How many here have read these books? Okay, good number of you. And you read these stories, and one of the things that's really profound about these stories is that they're very simple, but a key part of the story usually is some miracle that God did. Like this one, The Borrowed Axe. Remember that story? There was a boy who wanted to attend Prophet Elisha's school and was probably in some kind of financial distress and had to borrow an axe to go cut the trees down. And he had a simple thing happen. The head of the axe came off, fell in the river, and he was very distraught because it was a borrowed axe. And what did Prophet Elisha do about it? He had a prayer. And then he told the boy to do what? Throw a stick in the water as close to where he remembered the axe falling as he could. And when he did that, what happened? I hope you guys get the right story there. What happened? Oh, I knew you were going to say that. The axe started to swim, if I remember. All right? It didn't just float, it began to swim. Now, if I was Prophet Elisha right then, well, let me ask you. If you're Prophet Elisha right there, you're down at the Fraser River, and somebody's axe head comes off. You might have a prayer. I would hope you would. But what would you do then? Would you tell the owner of the axe or the borrower of the axe to throw the stick in because he was going to see God bring the axe to the surface? No, I'd be like, not sure I'm hoping God will do something, but I'm not really confident that God will do something. Then another story that is one of my personal favorites of all time is the story right there about Little Maid. Remember that story? Now, there could be a whole sermon preached on that story. And I actually was going to preach it here until my wife told me she wanted to preach on something different. See? No, actually, I thought this would be I felt impressed this was a good subject. But when you look at what happened to that little girl, she was not there because she wanted to be there. She was there because the man she was working for was cruel and, I dare say, evil. She's going to perceive him as that. And I think that she goes in the story here. Let me just show you the picture. Okay. She goes in taking breakfast to Lady Naaman. And when she takes the breakfast in to Lady Naaman is crying. And why was Lady Naaman crying? Because Captain Naaman had leprosy. And if I was Little Maid, I can promise you what I would do. I would pray. But I would not pray for Naaman's healing. I would pray that he would die and that then I could leave and go back to my home. I see I'm probably not the only one that would pray that. Okay? But not only did she pray, she made a statement to Lady Naaman. And what did she say? If your husband will go to my country and see the prophet, there's a good chance that that prophet might have some ideas on how for him to get well. Is that what she said? No. She said, if he will go, what will happen? The prophet will know what to do. Not maybe. Now, how many lepers was she aware of that Elisha had healed? None. Jesus made that point clear. He said there were many lepers in Israel, and not one of them was healed except for Naaman. Now, if not one leper in Israel had been healed, and there were many of them, what gave little maid confidence to state with assurance that if he would go to see Elisha, he would get healed? What was that? Something. Obviously, the faith came from God's word, for sure. The relationship that she had with Jesus. But I want to get into that a little bit more. You know, the last one I'm going to show you is, we just read this one, I think, this past week in our worship at my house. And this one is a room and a boy. Anybody remember that story? Okay, the woman of Shunem. And she builds a room on the top of her house. And Elisha comes and is grateful. And he promises her that there would be a baby born. Now, if I was a prophet, that's easy to say, right? You know, you're going to have a baby because I'm a prophet and God listens to what I say. But I am not sure that that's the experience that Elisha had. I think that he didn't know that he had any special in with God and that if he said something would happen. I think he happened to know God well enough that he knew how God ticked. And the same thing later, the prophet was in the town of Dothan. Remember, they get up in the morning, and the servant goes out to get things ready for the day, and he looks out the window, or he hears the rumors talking about in the village, and they say the Syrians are here to get you and your master, and they're pretty upset. So he rushes up to Elisha and he says, what are we going to do? There's a whole bunch of them and the town's not going to sacrifice itself for us. And what did Elisha say? He prayed. He prayed, right? And he said, Lord, open his eyes. Do you think when Elisha looked out over the wall or out the window or whatever it was, do you think he saw those angels? No. No, he didn't see them. He knew they were there because he knew God. Right? And so now, Elisha's special prayed for boy, friend here, gets a heat stroke, and Elisha goes into his room, and he's dead, and Elisha lays on that. Well, first he sends a servant. The servant doesn't do it. It doesn't have success. At that point, I would say, maybe it's not God's will to heal this boy. But that's not what Elisha did. He went up there, and he laid on that boy to warm him up. Now, when you think about it, did God need that boy to get warmed up? No. But Elisha was like, I'm going to do everything I can to get the boy back into a condition to live, even though he knew that that was totally futile. And then he prayed. And how many times did he pray? A long time. I think it was 7 times. Yeah. And I think along the way, again, I would be very, very tempted to say, this might not be God's will to do this. I mean, how often do people get raised from the dead? If that was something that God wanted to do, lots of people would get raised from the dead. So why do I believe that this particular boy on this particular day is going to get resurrected? Why is it that for me, and this may not be anybody else's experience, but for me, when I get into a situation, like I remember hearing some years back about a young man who was attending a class, I believe it was in a communist country, and the professor stood up in front of his class and he said a whole bunch of things to prove that God didn't exist. And then he made his crowning little presentation. He said, look, I want anybody in this room, after hearing my arguments, I want anybody in this room who still believes to stand up. And this one lone young man who was a student in the class stood up. And he said, I want you to come forward. He came forward. He said, I want you to pray. I'm holding in my hand a piece of chalk. Have any of you heard the story? Holding in my hand a piece of chalk. And he said, I want you to pray that God will prevent that chalk from breaking when I throw it on the ground. And if there is a God, then when I throw this chalk on the ground, it won't break. And if it does break, that proves that prayer doesn't work and there isn't a God. Now, at that point, first off, I don't think I would have had the courage. I hate to have to admit it, but I don't think I would have had the courage to stand up. But I hate to have to be that honest, but it's still the truth. But at that point, I would say, well, it might not be God's will. So this young man courageously prayed that God would reveal himself to that class and to that professor that day that he did exist according to his will. And that professor was so furious that somebody would have the audacity to pray that prayer after the spectacle that he had made, that he wanted to make sure that that chalk would break. So he held it over his head and he brought it down with all the force he could bring. But because he wanted to make sure it would break, he held on to it a little longer than he should have. And it hit his pant leg and rolled unbroken onto the floor. At which point the professor fled from the room. The thing that I believe happens is we don't have confidence in prayer because of our own experience. So why is it that we have not had that experience in prayer? I think it's the last text that I want to read right now, is James 4. And this is a very uncomfortable verse. James chapter 4 and verse 3. And it says, here's the answer to the question. Why does God not answer prayer? It says, you ask and you do not receive. Why? Okay, I like the New International. It says, you ask with wrong motives. You ask with wrong motives. What is the motive that we ask for, does he say? We ask God for stuff because it's what we want. You know, I've read many times, just finishing reading here, it says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Now, I think that's probably a pretty apt description of my Ski-Doo TNT 340. Whatever rationale I might have given for it, I was clearly wanting to get that so I could spend it on my pleasure. The word motive actually means that it is a need or desire that causes you to act. So the question that you ask is the reason that I'm praying, is my desire for this prayer, what's making me pray, something that I want for myself or for me and mine, or is it something different? And I was mistaken. I did have another verse. Philippians 2. This right here, when you put these two together, gives the picture. Paul, we're very familiar with this passage. Paul says in Philippians 2 and verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Did you know that the word also is put in there by the translators? Because even the translators didn't think that way it was written was really the right way. What he said was, if you look at the Greek there, it's look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And when you look at the word look to, that word actually could be translated to spy. Now, in your mind, create this picture of what you would be doing if you were spying. You're trying to see what someone else is doing without them knowing that you're watching to see what they're doing. And in spy operations, you're pretty focused on that. You're very, very intent on getting that intelligence so that you can make decisions and act on those decisions without them knowing that you got that information. Now, if you put that into this picture here, what Paul is saying is that our role as Christians is not to think about ourselves and our needs and our problems and our disappointments and our joys and our family's needs and joys and so on and so forth, but to go spying, to be seeing what the needs and disappointments and discouragements and joys and sorrows of other people are without them knowing that we did that, and then to do what? To act on it. Now he follows this up as justification for this concept. He says, your attitude or your mind should be the same as that of Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. In other words, Jesus' right was to be God. But he set that aside and focused his whole attention on the needs of a race that had chosen to sin. And he looked after their needs and not his own need. And then it goes on and describes what he did, making himself of no reputation, becoming a servant, humbling himself to death. And then as a result, what happens? In verse 9, therefore, God will do what? Exalt him to the highest place. Give him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. By Jesus setting aside his own needs and focusing exclusively on the needs of others, God takes care of Jesus' needs and gives him the position that was rightfully his. Now, in Jesus' life on this earth, the disciples came to him and said, "Boy, we wish we could pray like you." And what did Jesus say was the way that we should pray? He said, when you pray, pray like this. What did he say? Our Father, give us our daily bread, forgive our sins, deliver us from evil. There's not one first-person pronoun in the Lord's Prayer, not one. When I pray, I say, "Dear Lord, please forgive me. Please give me the confidence that I'm your child. Please lead me not into temptation. Give me what I'm looking for." Everything in my prayer to God is about what I need. And the thing that is interesting about this prayer is that when you combine it with James 4, the way to have answered prayer is to focus on the needs of others. Every need we have, we know that somebody else is experiencing those needs. Because Paul tells us, there's no temptation taken us but such as is common to man. You know, if I have a car that's having problems, I can empathize and sympathize with other people who are also having trouble with their car. And I've found this to really, this concept to really change the way that I have thought about prayer. When I look at any need that I have, instead of saying, "God, please supply this need," to think instead, who else out there in my acquaintance might be dealing with that, and what can I do to help God answer that prayer on our behalf? And I believe that God's promise is unequivocal, that if we stop thinking about our own needs, God says, "Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be given to you." When we think instead about the needs of others, every need that was met in those stories that I told you was a circumstance in which somebody prayed for someone else's need, and that's what gave them the confidence. And secondly, we're told very clearly that at no time in Jesus' earthly ministry did he ever perform a miracle for himself. And yet I'm always asking God to perform a miracle for me. So I think that if we did that, our joy would be full, because we would be seeing God working miracles in the lives of others. And God would then, of course, supply my need. That's just the way that God works.